In a small town tucked away between high mountains and a vast, emerald-green forest, lived a young man named Liam. Liam was not an ordinary citizen. He was a man of great ambition and immense physical strength. While others were content with a simple, slow-paced life, Liam always felt the urge to prove himself. He believed in the power of hard work, grit, and tireless effort. To him, success was a mountain that could only be climbed by those who never stopped moving. One day, the region's most respected lumber company announced it was looking for a new woodcutter. This wasn't just any job, it was an opportunity to work alongside Master Silas, a man of legendary status who was said to possess a wisdom as deep as the forest itself. Liam, fueled by his desire to be the best, applied for the position immediately. The interview was unlike anything he expected. Master Silas didn't ask about his muscles or his experience with heavy machinery. He simply looked into Liam's eyes and asked, "Why do you want to cut trees?" Liam stood tall and replied with confidence, "Because I am the strongest. I can work longer and harder than anyone else. I have a growth mindset, and I will not stop until I am the top producer in this forest." Silas smiled, a thin, mysterious smile, and handed him a brand new, gleaming axe. "The job is yours. We start tomorrow at dawn." That night, Liam could hardly sleep. He was already, skill stacking, in his mind, imagining the perfect swing and the most efficient way to move through the woods. He wanted to show the master that he wasn't just a worker, but a force of nature. When the first rays of the sun hit the forest floor, Liam was already at his station. With a roar of energy he began his work. Thwack! 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 The sound of his axe echoed through the trees. He didn't take breaks. He didn't look at the birds. He didn't even stop for a sip of water. By the time the sun began to set, Liam had cut down 18 massive trees. It was a record-breaking performance for a first day. Master Silas approached him, looked at the pile of timber, and nodded. "Well done, young man. You are truly efficient." Liam felt a surge of pride. He was exhausted, but he was also triumphant. He believed that if he kept this pace, he would soon become a legend himself. He didn't realize that the master's praise was not just for his strength, but a quiet observation of his methods. As Liam walked home, his muscles aching but his spirit high, he was already planning for the next day. He thought, "If I did 18 today, I will do 20 tomorrow." He was so focused on the trees that he didn't even notice the microscopic dullness starting to form on the edge of his blade. The race had begun, but Liam didn't know that he was running toward a wall he couldn't climb with strength alone. The next morning, the sun had not yet cleared the horizon when Liam's eyes snapped open. His body, however, did not share the same enthusiasm as his mind. Every muscle, from his shoulders down to his calves, was screaming in protest. The 18 trees from the previous day had left their mark. But Liam was a firm believer in the philosophy of no pain, no gain. He rolled out of bed, ignored the stiffness in his joints, and headed back to the forest. His goal for the day was clear: 20 trees. He wanted to build momentum. He believed that if he didn't improve every single day, he was failing. When he reached the clearing, Master Silas was already there, leaning against a stump and carving a small piece of wood with a tiny knife. He looked at Liam's weary eyes but said nothing. Liam grabbed his axe, the same gleaming tool from yesterday, and began. Thwack! 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 The rhythm felt the same, but the results were different. By noon, Liam noticed something frustrating. The wood seemed tougher today. He was swinging with the same force, but the blade didn't bite as deep into the bark. "I must be tired," he muttered to himself, wiping sweat from his forehead. He decided to skip his lunch break entirely. He thought, "If I am slower, I must work longer to compensate." As the afternoon shadows grew long, Liam was gasping for air. His hands were starting to blister, and his swings were becoming erratic. He was no longer the graceful force of nature he had been the day before. He was a man struggling against the forest. When the sun finally set, he counted his tally. 15. He had worked 3 hours longer than the day before, yet he had cut 3 fewer trees. The disappointment was crushing. He felt like a failure. Master Silas walked over, handing him a canteen of cool water. "You worked very hard today, Liam," Silas said quietly. Liam looked down at his boots, his voice thick with frustration. "It wasn't enough, Silas. I went backward. I'm losing my edge." Silas looked at the axe lying in the dirt, then back at Liam. "Tomorrow is another day," was all the master said before walking back into the shadows of the trees. Liam stayed in the clearing for a long time, staring at his hands. He was trapped in the expectation paradox. The harder he tried to beat his record, the further it slipped away. He was so focused on the quantity of his work that he was becoming blind to the quality of his process. The third day began in total darkness. Liam hadn't slept. He had spent the night staring at the ceiling, analyzing his every movement from the day before. He was convinced that the problem wasn't his strategy, but his intensity. In his mind, the only solution to a lack of results was to increase the volume of his labor. He arrived at the forest 2 hours before dawn, his breath visible in the cold morning air. His hands were wrapped in rough bandages to cover the blisters, and his muscles felt like heavy lead. Yet his jaw was set with a grim determination. "If 15 wasn't enough," he whispered to the shadows, "then I will simply refuse to stop until I hit 20. As the first light of day filtered through the canopy, the sound of the axe began. But it wasn't the sharp, rhythmic melody of the first day. It was a heavy, desperate thud. Liam was swinging with every ounce of his remaining strength, his body twisting with the effort of every blow. He was practicing what he called extreme grit, a belief that the human will could overcome any physical limitation. He didn't look up when Master Silas arrived. He didn't acknowledge the birds or the wind. He was in a state of tunnel vision, focused entirely on the bark of the tree in front of him. By midday, the heat was stifling, and Liam was drenched in sweat. His coordination was failing. Several times, his axe slipped, grazing the wood instead of biting into it. Each mistake felt like a personal insult. He began to curse the trees, the axe, and the heat. He felt as though the entire forest was conspiring against him. Master Silas sat nearby, calmly sharpening his own tools with a whetstone, the rhythmic shing-shing of the stone acting as a painful contrast to Liam's chaotic, noisy struggle. Silas looked at Liam with a mixture of pity and patience, but he remained silent, knowing that some lessons can only be learned through the bitterness of failure. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, Liam's strength finally gave out. He collapsed against a fallen log, his chest heaving, his hands shaking so violently he had to let go of the axe. He looked at the trees he had managed to fell. He didn't even need to count them to know the truth. The pile was smaller than ever. 10. Only 10 trees. He had worked 14 hours. He had pushed his body to the absolute limit of human endurance. He had sacrificed his sleep, his comfort, and his dignity, and for what? To be half as productive as he was on his first day. The silence of the forest felt heavy and mocking. Liam felt a lump in his throat, a mix of anger, exhaustion, and a terrifying sense of inadequacy. He had always believed that hard work was the ultimate currency, but now he was bankrupt. He looked at Master Silas, who was standing a few feet away, looking at the dull, battered edge of Liam's axe. Liam's voice cracked as he spoke. "I did everything right, Silas. I worked longer. I stayed later. I gave everything I had. Why is the world rewarding me with nothing?" He was at his breaking point, the moment where the philosophy of more is better finally shattered against the hard reality of inefficiency. Liam was about to learn that in the world of high performance, the loudest worker is rarely the most effective one. The forest was swallowed by an heavy, expectant silence as the last of the twilight vanished. Liam remained slumped against the log, his head bowed, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. He felt smaller than he ever had in his life. All his strength, his grit, and his relentless ambition had led him to this, a pile of 10 meager logs and a body that felt like it was falling apart. Master Silas didn't move for a long time. He simply stood there, a silhouette against the rising moon, watching the young man crumble under the weight of his own expectations. Finally, Silas took a step forward. The dry leaves crunched softly under his boots, a sound of deliberate, calm movement that Liam found almost irritating in his state of chaos. Silas didn't offer a hand to help Liam up. Instead, he reached down and picked up Liam's axe. He held it up to the moonlight, turning it slowly. The once gleaming edge was now nicked, jagged, and completely dull. It looked more like a blunt hammer than a tool for a professional woodcutter. "You have been very busy, Liam," Silas said, his voice as steady as the mountains. "You have been obsessed with the more. More hours, more swings, more sweat. You thought that by increasing the volume of your effort, you could force the forest to give you what you wanted. But look at this tool. Look at what you have done to it." Liam didn't look up. "I didn't have time to look at it, Silas. I was too busy working. Every minute I spent looking at the axe was a minute I wasn't cutting. I thought that was the growth mindset. I thought that was how you win." Silas let out a short, dry laugh, not a laugh of mockery, but of profound realization. "Liam, you have fallen into the oldest trap of the ambitious. You confused activity with productivity. You mistook movement for progress. You spent 14 hours today fighting the wood, but you weren't actually cutting it. You were bruising it. You were trying to break the trees with raw, blunt force because you neglected the one thing that actually does the work, the edge." He sat down on the log next to Liam and placed the battered axe between them. "In this forest, and in the life you want to build, your edge is everything. It is your skills, your clarity, and your mental energy. When you ignore the edge to focus on the hours, you encounter the law of diminishing returns. The harder you work with a dull blade, the more exhausted you become, and the less you actually achieve. You are not losing your strength, Liam. You are losing your effectiveness because you refuse to stop." Liam finally lifted his head, his eyes red with fatigue and frustration. "So what was I supposed to do? Sit around and wait for the trees to fall? I have goals, Silas. I have a vision." Silas picked up his whetstone from his belt. "A vision without a sharp tool is just a hallucination. To be truly efficient, to practice true deep work, you must understand that the pause is just as important as the swing. Tomorrow, you will not touch a single tree. Tomorrow, we will not focus on the forest. We will focus on the stone." Liam looked at the small, gray whetstone in Silas's hand. It seemed so insignificant compared to the massive trees he wanted to conquer. He didn't understand yet that the smallest movements often create the biggest impacts. He was still thinking like a laborer, while Silas was trying to teach him to think like an architect of his own effort. For the first time in 3 days, Liam didn't plan his next swing. He just sat in the darkness, listening to the quiet rhythm of the forest, wondering if he was brave enough to actually stop. The next morning was the most difficult one Liam had ever faced. For the first time in his professional life, he arrived at the forest without the intention of felling a single tree. As the sun began to rise, the silence felt agonizing. His hands instinctively reached for his axe, but Master Silas was already there, blocking his path to the timber. Instead of pointing toward the woods, Silas pointed to a flat, mossy rock near a small stream. On the rock sat a bucket of water and a collection of whetstones in various sizes and textures. "Today, Liam, your work is not about strength. It is about precision," Silas said, handing him the largest, coarsest stone. "You feel restless because you believe that if you aren't moving your muscles, you aren't making progress. This is the greatest lie of the modern mind. You must learn that the time spent at the stone is not a break from the work, it is the most vital part of the work itself." Liam sat down, his legs shaking with suppressed energy. He took his battered axe and began to rub the stone against the jagged edge. At first, he moved with his usual aggressive speed, trying to finish the task as quickly as possible so he could return to the real work. The friction was loud and chaotic. Silas immediately placed a hand on Liam's shoulder. "Slow down. If you rush the sharpening, you will create a brittle edge that breaks under pressure. You must feel the metal. You must listen to the sound of the stone. Sharpening requires a different kind of intensity, not the intensity of force, but the intensity of focus. Liam took a deep breath and slowed his movements. He began to pour water over the stone, watching as the gray slurry washed away the tiny fragments of worn-out metal. Hours passed. His back began to ache from the sitting, but it was a different kind of pain than the exhaustion of the previous days. It was the pain of patience. As he worked, he noticed something strange. As the edge of the axe became smoother and brighter, his own mind began to feel clearer. The chaotic noise of his to-do list and his desperate need to beat his record started to fade away. He was no longer thinking about 20 trees. He was thinking only about the half-inch of steel in front of him. Most people fear the stone, Liam, Silas remarked, watching the young man's meticulous progress. They fear it because it is quiet. It forces them to face their own thoughts. They would rather work themselves into a state of total burnout with a dull tool than spend 1 hour in the silence of self-improvement. They call it being busy, but it is actually a form of cowardice. It takes more courage to stop and sharpen than it does to keep swinging a useless blade. By late afternoon, the transformation was complete. Liam held the axe up to the light. The nicks and scratches were gone. The edge didn't just look sharp, it looked lethal. It possessed a mirror-like finish that reflected the surrounding forest. He touched the blade lightly with his thumb, feeling a cold, biting sharpness that sent a shiver down his spine. He looked at Silas, expecting a command to finally go and cut. But Silas simply took the axe and placed it back in its leather sheath. "The work for today is finished," Silas said. "Go home. Eat well. Sleep without guilt. Tomorrow, the forest will still be there, but you will be a different man when you enter it. You have reclaimed your edge, Liam. Now you must learn how to use it without losing yourself again." For the first time in a week, Liam walked home with his head held high, carrying a tool that was ready for the task, and a mind that finally understood the power of the pause. When Liam arrived at the clearing the following dawn, the air felt different. It wasn't the frantic, heavy atmosphere of the first 3 days. Instead, there was a crisp, focused energy in the morning breeze. He didn't rush to the trees like a starving man running toward a meal. He moved with a deliberate, calm grace. He unbuckled the leather sheath from his axe and looked at the blade. The day of the stone had transformed it into a masterpiece of utility. It was no longer just a piece of heavy metal, it was a precision instrument. Master Silas was sitting on his usual stump, sipping hot tea from a wooden cup. He didn't give Liam any commands or goals for the day. He simply nodded toward the treeling. This time, the silence wasn't a challenge, it was a canvas. Liam approached a massive oak, the kind of tree that would have taken him an hour of chaotic, exhausting swinging on his 3rd day. He planted his feet, adjusted his grip, and focused entirely on the exact point where he wanted the blade to strike. He didn't use all his strength. He didn't scream or roar. He simply let the weight of the sharp axe head do the work. Crack! The sound was totally different from the dull thwack of the previous days. It was sharp, clean, and resonant. The blade sank deep into the heartwood of the oak, biting through the tough fibers with startling ease. Liam pulled the axe back and swung again, hitting precisely the same spot. The wood chips that flew into the air weren't small, ragged splinters. They were large, clean chunks. Within 15 minutes, the massive oak groaned, tilted, and crashed to the forest floor with a thunderous roar. Liam stood there, breathing evenly, hardly sweating. He looked down at his hands. They weren't shaking. He looked at the axe. The edge was still perfectly sharp. He realized that the effort required to cut the tree was less than half of what he had used before. By midday, Liam had already felled 12 trees. He was moving with a smooth, almost hypnotic rhythm. He wasn't thinking about the final number. He was practicing a form of deep work. He was so completely immersed in the task, the angle of the swing, the sound of the cut, the structure of the wood, that time seemed to disappear. When he felt a slight stiffness in his shoulders, he did something he had never done before. He stopped. He sat down, drank some water, and ran a small pocket whetstone over the blade for 5 minutes. He was proactively protecting his edge before it could dull. When the sun finally began to set, Silas walked over to count the timber. He didn't seem surprised, but a look of deep satisfaction settled in his eyes. 22. Liam had shattered his own impossible goal, but he didn't feel the need to boast or celebrate wildly. He felt a profound sense of quiet competence. He had worked fewer hours than on the third day, used significantly less energy, and yet, the results were extraordinary. Silas placed a hand on Liam's shoulder. "Do you see it now, Liam? The magic is not in the muscle, it is in the method. You did not conquer the forest today by being stronger. You conquered it by being sharper. You have learned the difference between working hard and working with leverage. But remember, the edge is fragile. The forest will always try to dull it. Your only job now is to never let yourself become blunt again." Liam nodded, finally understanding that true mastery was not about how fast he could swing, but about how well he maintained the instrument of his success. A week had passed since Liam mastered the Day of the Stone, and he had settled into a rhythm that seemed almost supernatural to the other workers in the forest. While others were loud, sweating, and constantly complaining about the hardness of the timber, Liam moved with a quiet, lethal precision. However, nature has a way of testing even the most refined systems. On the 8th day, the sky didn't turn blue, it turned a bruised, ominous purple. The air grew heavy and still, the kind of silence that precedes a great turbulence. A massive storm was rolling in from the mountains, and the lumber company issued a final warning: any wood not felled and secured by sunset would be lost to the rising river. The forest exploded into a frenzy of activity. The other woodcutters, driven by fear and the pressure of the deadline, began to swing their axes with reckless abandon. They were running between trees, shouting at one another, and pushing their bodies beyond the point of safety. They were reverting to the old way, thinking that raw speed and frantic energy were the only ways to survive the crisis. Liam felt the old familiar pull of panic in his chest. His heart began to race, and for a split second, he wanted to join the chaos. He wanted to run, to sweat, and to prove his grit by being the loudest worker once again. Master Silas was standing by the river, watching the water rise. He didn't look at the trees, he looked at Liam. He didn't say a word, but his steady gaze was a reminder. Liam took a deep breath, closed his eyes for a moment, and forced his heart rate to slow down. He realized that a crisis was not an excuse to abandon his principles. It was the ultimate reason to uphold them. Instead of rushing to the nearest tree, Liam sat down on his mossy rock. He pulled out his whetstone. The other woodcutters mocked him as they ran past, their faces red with exertion. "Liam, what are you doing? The storm is coming! We don't have time for your games!" one shouted, his voice cracking with stress. Liam didn't answer. He focused entirely on the friction of the stone against the steel. He spent 10 minutes, 10 precious, high-stakes minutes, sharpening his blade. He wasn't just sharpening the metal, he was sharpening his composure. He was sharpening the saw, while the world around him was falling into a blunt panic. When he finally stood up, the first heavy drops of rain began to fall. The wind was howling through the canopy, making the trees sway dangerously. The other men were already exhausted, their swings becoming weak and erratic as the pressure mounted. Liam, however, was fresh. He approached the tallest trees, the ones the others were too afraid or too tired to touch. With his razor-sharp edge and a mind as calm as the eye of the storm, he began to work. Each swing was a masterpiece of timing. He used the wind's own energy to help fell the trees, timing his strikes with the gusts of the storm. By the time the river began to overflow, Liam had secured more timber than 3 other men combined. While the others had broken their tools or injured themselves in their haste, Liam finished the day with an intact axe and a steady hand. He had learned that true resilience is not about running faster when things go wrong, it's about having the foresight to maintain your edge so that when the storm arrives, you don't have to fight the world, you simply have to move through it. As the workers huddled under the shelter, shivering and defeated, Liam sat quietly, wiped the moisture from his blade, and placed it back in its sheath. The storm had passed, and his edge remained. Success in the forest was supposed to bring respect, but for Liam, it brought something far more complicated: isolation. As the weeks passed, the gap between Liam's production and that is his peers became impossible to ignore. While the other woodcutters were physically deteriorating, their backs hunched, their eyes bloodshot from fatigue, and their tempers short, Liam looked more energized than ever. He was felling 20 to 25 trees a day with what appeared to be effortless ease. But in the crowded mess hall at night, the air was thick with a new kind of friction. A group of woodcutters, led by a veteran named Marcus, began to spread whispers. Marcus had been in the forest for 15 years and believed that sweat was the only currency of truth. To him, Liam's efficiency wasn't a result of skill, but a sign of deception. "Nobody works that little and produces that much," Marcus hissed one evening, loud enough for Liam to hear. "He must be using some kind of illegal tool, or perhaps he has a secret deal with the company. He's making the rest of us look bad by cheating the system." The tension finally reached a boiling point on a humid Tuesday afternoon. Liam was sitting on his usual rock, carefully applying oil to his blade, when Marcus and 3 others surrounded him. They didn't look like men who wanted to learn. They looked like men who wanted to fight. "Enough with the games, Liam," Marcus barked, kicking a pile of Liam's clean wood chips. "Show us the trick. We know you're using a special axe. No regular steel bites into oak like yours does. We work twice as hard as you, and we're barely hitting 10 trees. Give us the secret, or get out of this forest." Liam looked up, his expression calm and unbothered, a stoic mask that only served to irritate Marcus further. Liam didn't reach for his axe or stand up in a defensive posture. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his small, gray whetstone. He held it out in his open palm. "There is no magic axe, Marcus," Liam said quietly. "And there is no secret deal. The difference is right here. While you are using your lunch break to complain, I am using mine to sharpen. While you are swinging a dull blade with 100% of your strength, I am swinging a sharp blade with 40% of mine. You are fighting the wood, I am letting the tool do the work." Marcus looked at the small stone with utter contempt. He didn't want to hear about maintenance, precision, or sharpening the saw. He wanted a shortcut. He wanted a miracle. "A rock?" Marcus laughed bitterly. "You expect us to believe that a little piece of stone is why you're the top producer? We don't have time to sit around playing with rocks. We have work to do. You're just lazy, Liam. You're looking for the easy way out while real men break their backs." Liam realized at that moment a hard truth about human nature. Most people would rather fail in a familiar way than succeed in a way that requires them to change their habits. They viewed his sharpening as laziness, because it didn't look like the traditional, agonizing struggle they were used to. To them, if it wasn't painful, it wasn't real work. "If you want the result," Liam said, placing the stone on the rock between them, "you have to value the process. The stone is free for anyone to use. But if you refuse to stop, you will eventually break." Marcus turned away, followed by the others, leaving the whetstone untouched. They preferred their dull blades and their righteous anger to the quiet discipline of improvement. Master Silas, who had been watching the encounter from a distance, walked over once the others had vanished into the trees. "It is easy to sharpen a piece of metal, Liam," Silas remarked, looking at the stone. "But it is nearly impossible to sharpen a closed mind. You have mastered the axe, but now you must learn to navigate the envy that comes with excellence. Being the best doesn't just make you a leader, it makes you a target for those who are unwilling to grow." Liam watched his peers walk back to their trees, hearing the dull, inefficient thuds of their axes, realizing that his greatest challenge wasn't the forest anymore, it was the weight of being the only one who dared to stop and think. As the autumn leaves began to fall, signaling the end of the harvest season, Master Silas led Liam away from the familiar clearings of the forest. They walked deep into a narrow canyon where a massive landslide had occurred years ago. A chaotic mountain of fallen, ancient trees was wedged tightly between the canyon walls, blocking a vital stream. Silas stopped at the edge of the wreckage and turned to Liam. The village downstream needs this water for the winter. This logjam is a ticking time bomb. If the autumn rains come before this is cleared, the pressure will cause a flood that will destroy everything. Liam immediately stepped forward, reaching for his axe. His blade was like a mirror, reflecting the gray sky. I'll have it cleared by sunset, Silas. I've never seen a log my blade couldn't handle. But Silas placed a firm hand on Liam's arm. Stop. This is your final test, and it is the only one where your axe is useless. Look closely, Liam. These logs are under millions of pounds of pressure. They are tangled in an equilibrium of force. If you simply start cutting, the tension will release all at once. The logs will explode outward, and you will be crushed before you can take a second swing. You cannot solve this problem with force, and you cannot solve it with a sharp edge. Liam stared at the precarious pile of wood. For the first time in months, he felt a surge of the old helplessness. He was a woodcutter. His entire identity was built around the swing of his tool. To be told his tool was irrelevant felt like being stripped of his armor. If I can't cut, Liam whispered, then what am I supposed to do? I'm not a magician. You are an architect of effort now, Silas replied. You must learn to see the invisible tension. Every system, whether it is a pile of logs, a complex business, or a human life, has a key log. It is the one piece that holds all the pressure. If you find it and move it with precision, the entire structure will dismantle itself safely. If you don't find it, you are just a man screaming at a mountain. Liam sat on the ground, but he didn't pull out his whetstone. For hours he simply watched the logs. He watched how the water seeped through the gaps. He studied the angles of the trunks, and the way the weight of the top logs pressed down on the ones below. He was practicing a new level of deep work, mental simulation. He was looking for the point of greatest leverage. He realized that the sharpness he needed today wasn't in his hands, it was in his observation. The other woodcutters from the company, including Marcus, gathered at the top of the canyon to watch. They laughed and shouted down at Liam. Look at him! The great woodcutter has finally given up! He's just sitting there staring at wood like a philosopher. Where is your edge now, Liam? Liam ignored them. He was focused on a single, crooked cedar log wedged at the very bottom of the pile. It looked insignificant, almost hidden by the massive oaks above it. But Liam saw how every other piece of timber seemed to lean toward it. It was the key log. It was the source of the invisible tension. He didn't grab his axe. Instead, he found a long, sturdy branch to use as a lever. He didn't use his muscles to strike, he used his weight to nudge. With one deliberate, calculated push, he moved the crooked cedar just 3 inches. The canyon echoed with a sound like a crack of thunder. The massive pile of logs groaned and began to shift. Within seconds, the entire logjam, thousands of tons of wood, began to slide apart with a rhythmic, controlled grace. The water burst through, clear and powerful, flowing down toward the village. Liam stood back, untouched and calm, as the chaos organized itself into a peaceful stream. Master Silas walked over and looked at the flowing water. You see, Liam? The axe is for the branches, but the mind is for the system. You have finally learned that the greatest edge you possess is the ability to see the world not as a series of things to be hit, but as a series of forces to be understood. You have moved beyond being a laborer. You are now a master of your own energy. Liam looked up at Marcus and the others at the top of the canyon. They were silent now, their faces pale with shock. They had witnessed a miracle of efficiency, and for the first time, they realized that they weren't just slower than Liam. They were living in a completely different world of understanding. The first snow of winter arrived silently, dusting the emerald-green forest in a layer of pristine white. The frantic pace of the harvest had ended, and the heavy thuds of the lumber camp had been replaced by the crackling of fires and the whistling of the north wind. Liam stood at the edge of the clearing where his journey had begun months ago. He looked at the forest, not as an opponent to be conquered, but as a silent partner in his growth. He was no longer the restless, muscle-bound boy who had arrived with a blunt axe and a desperate need to prove himself. He was a man who moved with the quiet confidence of a master. Master Silas was standing by his small cabin, a simple traveler's pack slung over his shoulder. He looked older in the winter light, but his eyes remained as sharp as the tools he kept. He didn't say goodbye with a long speech. He simply walked over to Liam and handed him a small, worn leather pouch. Inside was the gray whetstone, the very one Liam had used on the day of the stone. "My time in this forest is finished, Liam," Silas said, his voice soft against the winter wind. "The trees have taught me all they can, and I have taught you all you were willing to learn. You came here seeking a job, but you found a craft. You came here seeking a record, but you found a rhythm. The forest is yours now." Liam felt a tightness in his throat. "Where will you go, Silas? There are still so many things I don't know. The logjam was just one problem. What if I encounter something I can't solve with a lever or an axe?" Silas smiled, and for the first time, it wasn't a mysterious or hidden smile. It was a look of genuine pride. "The stone is not just for the steel, Liam. It is for the soul. Whenever you feel yourself becoming blunt, whenever you feel the world pushing you toward the frantic and the blunt, return to the stone. The greatest danger for a master is the belief that he is finally sharp enough. Mastery is not a destination, it is a continuous act of maintenance. If you stop sharpening, you start dying." Without another word, Silas turned and walked into the misty treeline, his silhouette slowly disappearing into the falling snow. Liam stood alone for a long time, holding the whetstone in his hand. He realized that the master's departure was the final lesson. The guide can show you the path, but only you can walk it. As the sun reached its midday peak, a sound broke the silence of the winter forest. A young man, perhaps 19 years old, came marching up the trail. He was tall, with massive shoulders and a brand-new axe held tightly in his grip. He looked around with a cocky, aggressive energy that made Liam smile with a bittersweet memory. The young man walked straight up to Liam, ignoring the beauty of the snow or the stillness of the trees. "I'm looking for the master woodcutter," the boy said, his voice full of unearned confidence. "I heard he's the best, and I've come to take his place. I'm the strongest worker in the valley. I can work 18 hours a day without stopping. I don't need breaks, and I don't need rest. Just show me the trees, and I'll show you a record." Liam looked at the boy's axe. It was beautiful, but the edge was factory-made, sharp enough to cut, but too brittle to last. He saw the Liam of yesterday standing before him. He saw the same hunger, the same grit, and the same dangerous blindness to the process. Liam didn't point him toward the wood. He didn't challenge his strength. He simply sat down on the mossy rock near the stream, pulled out the leather pouch, and set the gray whetstone on his knee. He looked into the young man's eyes and asked the same question Silas had once asked him. "Why do you want to cut trees?" The boy laughed, a loud and hollow sound. "To be the best, of course. To win. Now, are we going to talk or are we going to work?" Liam nodded slowly, his fingers tracing the smooth surface of the stone. "We are going to work," Liam said softly. "But first, sit down. Before we touch the forest, we must talk about the edge. Because in this life, kid, if you're too busy cutting to sharpen your axe, you've already lost the race." Liam began to pour water over the stone, the rhythmic shing-shing sound echoing through the frozen forest. The cycle had begun again. The student had become the teacher, and the whetstone remained, the silent, eternal witness to the truth that the greatest work we ever do is the work we do on ourselves.